Hey guys, it's Judy from Nutrition with Judy. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you guys are having a good week. My name is Judy Cho, and I am a nutritional therapy practitioner. I work with clients to get to root cause healing, and oftentimes that is gut health with a meat-based elimination diet. Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Julia Rucklidge. Dr. Rucklidge is the Director of Mental Health and Nutrition Research Group at University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Her research with Dr. Bonnie Kaplan focuses on mental health and nutrition. Julia Rucklidge and Bonnie Kaplan have a book out called The Better Brain, where they talk about nutrition and how to support mental health and supporting anxiety, ADHD, and depression with actual, real, wholesome food. The reality is that 1 in 5 Americans suffer from mental illness, and this is just a common imbalance we are seeing, and maybe medication is not just the answer. Maybe it's not the best answer. So let's get into this discussion where we talk about this fascinating area that is very personal to me. Hi, Dr. Julia Rucklidge. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am so excited to have my audience kind of listen to your ideas about mental health and how food is so powerful with healing. So if you could just kind of introduce yourself to the people listening and watching.
Sure. So I'm a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Canterbury in Christchurch, New Zealand. And you can already probably tell that I don't sound New Zealander. I'm originally Canadian, and I did my undergraduate in neurobiology at McGill. And then I did my master's and PhD at the University of Calgary in southern Alberta, Canada. So I'm trained as a psychologist, which you might kind of at first go, why am I here to talk about nutrition? And I think it's more my scientist side that ended up delving into it rather than as the psychologist side. But essentially, when I was doing my PhD with Bonnie Kaplan, who I co-wrote The Better Brain with, she was approached by some families in southern Alberta, Canada, who were treating themselves with nutrients in a capsule form, minerals and vitamins in a capsule form. And they claimed that you could completely eliminate some symptoms associated with serious psychiatric problems like bipolar disorder, psychosis, etc. So initially, you can imagine that somebody like Bonnie, who was a professor of pediatrics at the time, was skeptical of this idea. But what's wonderful about Bonnie, and what I try to also provide for my students, is that you have to be curious. As scientists, we must be curious about new ideas, even if they contravene the current way of thinking, which nutrition, as being relevant to the brain, was certainly a challenging concept in the late 1990s. So, and my training in psychology taught me that nutrition was completely irrelevant to brain health. And in fact, could be, in some cases, they thought that it could be potentially detrimental. So but if you look at the data, and if we're honest about the data, and I think now by 2021, we're all on board, or most people are on board. I couldn't say all of us are on board, but I think most of us are starting to recognize that those treatments that were so exciting in the 1980s and the 1990s, the medications that were coming online for people who were struggling with serious mental health issues, they helped some people. Right. Some people had remarkable recoveries, but too many people have not gotten well with those medications. And the data are very clear about that now. And not only were people not getting to a place of wellness, but the long-term effects are uncovering themselves, and they are certainly concerning in some cases, as well as the ability to come off of those drugs. So we're in a place now in 2021 where we're more open to the idea of looking at alternatives, not to replace necessarily, but so that we have more tools in our toolbox. Why rely just on medications and or psychotherapy if you can afford it? If there are other ways that we can empower ourselves to change our food environment in order to achieve better mental health. So, sorry, long answer. Don't even know if I answered it.
No, that's
Who I am and why I do what I do, which is that I decided to be curious, be the critic and conscience of society, and just find out, do these nutrients actually confer a positive health benefit? If they do, then that's something that you'd think everybody would want to know about, particularly governments and our public healthcare systems. So that's kind of why I went down it incredibly naively, and I discovered that there's an awful lot of opposition to propagating this idea that you should care about the nutrients in your food. So unfortunately, that's been one of the challenges of doing this work.
right. I can imagine. In terms of the book, so do you kind of lay out, what nutrients you may need to support the brain? Like what kind of is covered in this book that you're talking about?
Yeah. So we came from the perspective of studying the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals in a pill form, comparing it to placebo, as well as doing other experimental designs. But we've done placebo controlled trials, which is where that's kind of viewed as the gold standard. They're not my favorite trial because there's a lot of controls and they don't necessarily always translate to the real world, but they are useful part of the big picture that showed that people who were taking the nutrients showed greater change and benefit for their mental health symptoms that we were treating relative to placebo. So that's a pretty powerful finding. But really, when you then kind of go, okay, so with these vitamins and minerals, which we gave in quite high doses, like that is, not a dose that we call a mega dose, but just higher than what we're kind of used to in a supermarket type of pill. But actually aligned, if you were to eat a lot of real whole foods that are really nutrient dense, you may well, if you really focused on it, you might be able to get close to that. Although I think it would be still kind of hard because there are probably some people who need more nutrients than others just because of maybe genetic differences and other things that are going on for them. So you take these studies, and we could just say, well, we should just supplement everyone. But what we've done instead is we've kind of stepped back and said, hold on, why is it that these nutrients have conferred such a good health benefit? Surely people are getting these nutrients from their food. And so then when you start to look at population data, big studies on looking at people's diets, what you sadly realize is that half of the calories people are eating are coming from ultra-processed junk. Those, and I'm sure you're familiar with those, Judy, and maybe your listeners, which is the stuff that I wouldn't even call food. It's not nourishing to your brain, and what we've been able to show, and others, you can just look it up, they're nutrient depleted. That is, they're very low in vitamins and minerals. And so you then kind of go and look at this startling data that our populations are not eating well. You then start to look at the correlation between eating these foods and mental health. And what's quite startling when you look at that is that people who are eating these foods pretty much as their main type of daily diet, and these are the foods, the ones with the packages, they've got the numbers all over them. They're full of high fructose corn syrup, and they've got preservatives and colors and flavors and emulsifiers and all these things that our bodies don't. Well, first of all, they don't need many of those things in the quantities that we're consuming, but they're also depleted in these vitamins and minerals. So the first thing that our data suggest is that you really need to reduce your intake of those foods and eat foods that are going to be micronutrient rich, because these micronutrients, what we actually discuss in the book, it's not new, but it hasn't been put together this way, is that micronutrients are absolutely essential for brain metabolism. You need them for your brain to operate. So for making neurotransmitters, you need them, micronutrients, as cofactors along the way to help the enzymes convert one chemical to another, and eventually make serotonin or dopamine. We need them for energy production. We need them to help us regulate our DNA. They're essential for everything that's happening in your body. So you need to sort of source, where can we find these vitamins and minerals in a much denser form? And that's where you then look to the research. Sorry, long answer. It's hard for me to say anything in a short way. Is that you look at the Mediterranean style diet, and that's the one where there's been the most research, and that's a diet that it's rich in foods across the board. You've got some meat, you've got the eggs, you've got the fish, you've got the fruit and vegetables, you've got the nuts, seeds, grains, and that when people eat a diet that's more consistent with that style diet, then you find that their mental health seems to be better. And then there's control trials that have shown where if you help people shift from that mostly ultra-processed stuff to a more real whole food diet, their mental health improves. So that's why I would align with the first principle of our research says, for whatever reason, some people aren't getting their nutrients out of their food. You need to be, first of all, eating foods that are nutrient dense. It doesn't work for everyone, and I'm happy to go into that, but that's the first principle. Eat real food.
Do you think that somebody that were to eat most of the nutrient dense foods and then were to still eat some of the processed foods would still have the benefits of the mental health? Or is it just they also need to remove the processed foods because of the toxins that then debilitate mental health?
Yeah, you need to, one doesn't cancel out the other. So, you can't because you've eaten some healthy food that sort of gives you that gives you a free ride to eat a whole bunch of foods that aren't going to be so good for your brain. So the research is pretty clear that it's best to reduce. You don't have to eliminate. If you are eating a mostly real whole food diet and an occasional treat, absolutely, and enjoy it, an ice cream or whatever it is that you fancy. But when you look at the data that says that 50% of people's calories are coming from those foods, right, that's when we need to be concerned about that. So occasional treat, I don't see that as an issue. And I think the data are pretty clear that a small amount of that is okay. But that if that's your main focus of your food, then that's where you really need to be reducing your intake massively of those foods.
Right. And I think that is a big reason why so many people are sick, because that is the bulk of what we eat is processed food, packaged food. It's easy, it's convenient.
Yeah.
In this now culture. In general, it seems like mental health, depression has just really escalated more now than ever. Do you think we are more aware of it, or that it's really just increasing?
Yeah, it's hard to know absolutely for certain, because there's all the mental health campaigns to get people to go and present to their doctor and say that they're struggling with a mental health issue. So there are those other forces that are out there. We do seem to have more mental health professionals out there, so they are more likely than to be diagnosing these challenges. But it's hard to not ignore the role that the massive change in the food environment over the last 100 years may have played a role in also increasing, not necessarily our psychiatric disorders per se, but what I think happens, and again, it's supported by research that we've done both here and overseas, is that if you eat mostly these really low nutrient dense foods, you're not giving the brain and the body the fuel it needs to operate. So it's like running your car on empty constantly. And I wonder whether or not what happens is that the massive reduction in the nutrient intake is making us less resilient to things that are happening to us. So in case in point, coronavirus, not necessarily getting sick, but just the fear of getting sick and all of the stressors associated with the lockdowns and all the policy changes and having to be vigilant of your environment and fear of getting this illness or the virus. So you're constantly on fight flight mode. So if you then realize that the fight-flight response is nutrient dependent, to make adrenaline, to make cortisol, to support that incredibly essential system we have to ensure our survival, then you kind of go, okay, well, are you eating foods that are going to support your fight-flight response? And then you need more nutrients to support everything else because they get diverted to the fight-flight response because it's going to always go to the fight-flight response first because it's for short-term survival. Yeah. So then what gets compromised when you don't have enough, you're just, all of your nutrient resources are going to the fight-flight response. There's nothing left to regulate your mood. There's nothing left to regulate your sleep. There's nothing left to regulate your attention. So to me, it seems like a pretty no-brainer when you understand the biochemistry to kind of say, you know what? We've got a population that's walking around completely nutrient depleted, and therefore they have no resources to cope with extra things that come along. No wonder we're stressed and tired and low energy and struggling with our mood and irritable. It certainly is at least playing a role.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I talk a lot on my channel about how stress, how our body will focus on priority of survival and the cortisol response.
Yeah.
And then there goes your sex hormones and
Yeah.
or not your thyroid, but your sex hormones and any other kind of hormone production. But one thing I find interesting is that a lot of our neurotransmitters are also produced in the gut. And so when we are eating foods with a lot of toxins, you have to wonder, well, you know, how is our gut health? And if it's not good, then maybe we're not producing the neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and so on. And that may also affect our mental health as well.
Well, it could. And there are some toxins that are starting to be identified as playing a role in our gut health. And the one that I'm probably more familiar with would be glyphosate, pesticides, herbicides. They clearly seem to be having, there's research, it's very brand new and it's still something that's been more like seriously investigated, but it does kind of make you pause and think about some of these things that we do put on our crops,
right,
that are probably not great for our microbiome. And we know that they can affect the bacterial composition of soil. And so there's also research that is highlighting the effects that it can have on your microbiome. New stuff. So we still have lots of questions, but it is something we should all kind of go, oh, I don't know if I should eat the foods that have got laden with that.
Right.
But it's very hard. It's very hard to not eat them. They're everywhere.
Right. I mean, it's all the GMO foods, especially.
Yeah, there's that too that you have in the States. We don't have that as much here. But.
Oh, okay. I want to kind of take a step back and maybe just get some understanding of, you know, why did we think that maybe SSRIs are the answer for kind of depression? I have clients that are on, antidepressants, and they've tried to wean themselves off it, and they eat more of the nutrient-dense diet. And they work with their doctor to reduce it, but then they notice that some of it comes back. So like there's like these pros and cons. So some of the negatives is they start getting restless leg syndrome at night, lots of that kind of cramping. But then the other hand is then they may not feel super depressed on it, but they won't feel much of anything in a sense. Like they're a lot more apathetic, but then without it, they'll kind of sometimes dip too. And so there's this like struggle. But just what are your thoughts of like, why did we start using SSRIs and why does it work for some and not so much for others?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I don't know if I have the full answer for why. And I don't think anybody has the full answer for why that happens, of why some people respond and others don't. And they do try to figure out what are the predictors of poor responders versus of people who are going to respond. And it's hard to uncover. There certainly isn't that one sort of magic, it's these people who are, we know are going to do well on it. I mean, the bottom line, first of all, is that no one is tested for their serotonin before getting put on an antidepressant. And that in itself should be somewhat sobering, given the you're sold on it correcting some serotonin deficiency that's never proven at an individual level and has never even been proven at a group level. But what we do know the SSRIs do is that they definitely have an effect on neurotransmission. That's very clearly shown, that they are affecting your serotonin system. So that's probably what we're observing, is the effect that mucking around with your serotonin seems to have an effect on your mood. And it's that interesting thing, is that flattening that a lot of people describe, or that they don't feel down, but they don't necessarily feel up. So it's like, it's now likened, there's people like Joanne Moncrief in the UK who talk about it as being that it's similar to any other drug that we take, whether it's that alcohol or it's heroin or any other type of drug, that they affect your brain function. Your brain then becomes dependent on it because it gets used to it and it adapts to the presence of this drug, which is why even when you miss one dose of your SSRI, you feel it. Your brain doesn't feel right. And it's only sorted out by putting back in that medication. So it's had, it's certainly, you don't want to throw it out entirely, because there are people who I've heard of who have benefited, but it's just sadly not enough are doing well on it. And it just comes with a side effect profile and the real challenge of withdrawing. And my heart absolutely goes out to all of those people who have been on these medications for years and years and years and really want to come off of them. And what medicine hasn't focused on, and they could do this, and it's starting to come, is, we're very good at putting people on these drugs, but we don't have a lot of good methods to take them off of them. And so patients have to end up figuring it out often for themselves. There are now tapering strips that I think may help people like you describe come off of those medications. And so those may prove to be more and more useful, and there's more interest in trying to figure this one out, how to get people off. But what I do know is you've got to do it slowly. And that last dose, surprisingly, is one of the hardest for people to come off of. Really surprising, given what a small amount of the drug might be left to come off of. So taking that, small amount off at the beginning that seems fine, but at the end, that seems to be one of the hardest things. So I think having that knowledge that it is going to be hard, that you got to do it slowly, and that people have achieved it and have gotten there, and that using nutrients and eating well can help with that process, hopefully gives people a bit more, just courage to keep going when it's really hard. But to know that hard stuff isn't necessarily the reemergence of any underlying problem, that it's withdrawal. And that's something that not a lot of people talk about. And we talk about it in the book because it's knowledge, it's out there, it's in the public domain if you can look. It's written about in journals. We're just the messengers.
Yeah, and I've actually seen it in several clients as well, where they're dosing down and it seems fine. And then as they get to the smaller doses, it gets harder and harder. And it almost feels like they're regressing, but it may just be withdrawal. And there's several websites, and I'll link to some of them in the show notes. From your experience, so then have you seen patients where they were on medication and then they, do the food for kind of healing, and then they get off, and then they're not as, they don't go through bouts of depression anymore, and they just seem that.
Sure. My studies in New Zealand are on people who are medication free, and partly because of this challenge is that it's very hard to do controlled trials when you have people who, what we do know is that when you start to clean up your diet and or add extra nutrients in, like what we've been studying, that the medication, you get over medicated. It's like the medication is for a brain that was not functioning well. As you nourish it, you get a healthier brain. So then you have less need for that medication. And so you end up in an over-medicated situation. Unfortunately, a lot of prescribers don't think about it that way. And so they don't necessarily reduce the dose as is necessary as you're describing. So that's, that's just requires just more education. And I can understand where they're coming from if they come from a medical model and have been taught, like I had been taught, that nutrition was irrelevant. They're not going to think nutrition has any impact on dose of drugs, right? So absolutely, yes, there are people who have been able to transit from medication. I'm more familiar with those who use the supplements in addition to help with that transition, and it can be done. But it isn't an easy journey, and I always warn people of that it does make it a little bit harder when you've got this medication. And it is what it is. Science evolves and changes, and we start to see the downside of some things over time. And that's that we weren't aware of in the 80s and the 90s when people were first being put on these drugs. So hopefully, though, the bigger picture is that more and more people will start to think about their food environment first, right, before going on the medication. And that's a world I look forward to being a part of, where we are not reaching for the prescription of a drug as the first line of treatment.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Is there any specific, I know we talk about real whole foods, but is there a specific nutrients that you see kind of help people specifically with mental health, or is it just kind of eating real food?
So one thing that we try to dispel in the book is the single nutrient fallacy. Okay. That there's this one nutrient that if you just took that one, you'd feel great, like magnesium, zinc, or vitamin D. And we often hear about these magic bullets in the media, that are the cure-all for everything. And when we look, though, at the research that's been done on those single nutrients to see whether or not they can have a positive effect on mental health, overall, those studies are pretty modest, or they find nothing. So the effect is generally quite small, with a few exceptions. There are some interesting exceptions over in our history. Pellagra, which caused psychosis, was caused, and dermatitis and dementia, was caused by a niacin deficiency because people were only eating corn. And that was completely cured by adding in more niacin. So that's an example of where just one nutrient had a really positive effect on some people. But it was diet related. They probably could have just changed their diet, and that would have changed it too. But we let that was one reason that we started fortifying with niacin. So we've got these ideas that we're going to just find that single nutrient, but with the complex diseases, that's unlikely. Right. And so the premise that we go by is just saying, well, what does the biology say? And the biology says, as I was saying earlier, it says we need the full array of nutrients, not just one nutrient. The chemical pathways to make serotonin require multitude of minerals and vitamins, no special mineral and vitamin. So that's why our research is on the broad spectrum of the about 30 essential minerals and vitamins that we need to consume every day for optimal health. So there's no specific one. There's no specific food. You need to make sure you just eat foods that are rich in these nutrients. And if that, as I said, if that doesn't work, or that doesn't seem to bring you to the best of health, there's a lot of reasons why that might happen. Our soils are depleted of minerals, unfortunately. So our plants and our crops aren't going to be as rich in those nutrients as they used to be. As I was saying earlier, glyphosate has a detrimental effect as well can have an effect on the mineral content of the soil because it chelates to the minerals, and then it rains, and then it washes away the minerals, or it can have this effects on plants specifically. There's research that shows that it can reduce the mineral content of plants. So there's a whole host of agricultural things that have been going on. We select foods that grow quickly, that don't bruise, that store well, and we're not selecting foods that are nutrient dense. So there's all of those, and then there's individual differences. We're all unique. I mean, you certainly, I'm sure that's something you talk a lot about on your podcast.
Right.
We're all, we have genetic differences, and some of those mean that we have a greater need for certain nutrients than other people. And so if you combine that with the depletions, it might be that some people need to supplement in order to get to a good place of health. And those are the kinds of people that we work with in our clinical trials. And I can absolutely assure you that some of them only got there, not by changing just their diet, but by the additional nutrients.
See, I walk this kind of fine line with supplements and food. Yep. Because most people are like, well, food is medicine and food should fix everything. But then I consider the soil. So even cows eating the grass that have less, minerals in their soils, it's just this kind of, cycle where there's just less minerals in everything, including plants, meats, whatever it is. But then people are like, well, supplements are not, real, or they're man-made. And then but I see healing, like, especially with the gut, some of the gut healing supports I use, I see the healing in it. And so then it's like, it's this fine line of some people may need the supplements to kind of get better, and then some people just may not. Do you see people that kind of just can eat foods without any supplementation, if they struggled with mental health, thrive without any supplementation?
Right. Not specifically in our research, but then we're not looking for that.
Okay.
But what I can say is that having been doing this research for close to 15 years, and I did a TEDx talk in 2014 that's done really well. I think it's at about 1.8 million viewers. That means that there are a lot of comments on there, and I've received a lot of communication, thousands and thousands of emails over the years, and phone calls and social media. Goodness, they track you down in all kinds of different ways. So I've heard of stories. I certainly have heard of people who have done only a change in their diet, complete turnaround. And it might be that they go Mediterranean. It might be that they also eliminate other things, or they might go from one of the more specialized diets. Right. Might be that they go, vegan or keto or carnivore or gluten-free, dairy-free, you name it. There's lots of ways you can eliminate foods from your diet. But the consistent thing that's happening is that they're not eating marshmallows. They're eating real foods. But for some people, they're quite selective about what real foods they choose. So I've heard of stories across the board of people doing well on all kinds of different of those sort of more specialized diets. But for me, it's that the research says very clearly about the Mediterranean style or traditional style diets. So we always say you should do that first. Clean up your diet, eating more real foods. If that doesn't work, then you could try more specialized diets. For some people, yes, they do better on plants. Yes, they do better on more meat, more fish. There's some things that you can't get out of plants that are only contained within meat or fish, like essential fatty acids. The DHA and EPA is very hard to get out of a plant-based diet. Some people are probably do fine with the small amount they get out of the diet, but some people lack the enzymes that can convert ALA to EPA or DHA, so they may not get it. So for some people, it might be that they go vegan or plant-based and they still feel unwell. And in those cases, I think it might be that they do need to get some of the nutrients that are not as easily available from those types of foods. So it might be that they need to do one of these specialized diets, and that might solve it. And then for some people, it seems that the additional nutrients were necessary. So I guess an answer to your question is that yes, there's a lot of people out there who can do well just by changing their diet. And that's absolutely the message in our book is food first. Right. But for these other reasons, as I mentioned, the soil, the individual differences, gut health, increased load from toxins, or increased load from stressors, life stages, pregnancy, adolescence, getting older, they all influence our nutritional needs.
From your research, have you seen if there's certain toxins in our processed foods, or if it's, like some people say it's a lot of excess sugar damages our mitochondria, or there's like glycation. Some people say it's just all the toxins kind of combined, like the glyphosates, the dyes. It's a hodgepodge of everything. From your research, have you seen if it's anything specific?
Not per se, and it's difficult to really tease that one apart of which is it. Because even if you look at some of the old studies that looked at removing some very specific dyes in foods for the treatment of ADHD, what also happened was that they changed their diets. And so it's hard to know whether or not it was the removal of some of those ingredients in the foods, or was it because other things were added in order to, as substitutes. So it's really, really difficult to tease that apart. But overall, what I always say is that there hasn't been a single study that has shown that these foods have been good for us. Show me a study that's shown that this has been good for us, that it improves your mood and makes you feel great and great energy throughout the day, and you lose weight and you don't get diabetes, or your cognitive function is improved. Hasn't done anything good for us. So it's kind of a remarkable, not only social experiment, but also a continued social experiment of people continuing to think that it's okay to eat this way, and that governments support us eating this way, and do there's a lot of power involved in continuing to get us to eat this way, unfortunately. So we all have to kind of wake up individually, unfortunately, because the government's not going to do it for us.
I agree completely. One thing that's so unfortunate in the US is they subsidize a lot of the corn, which then makes all the high fructose corn syrup and all the corn syrup in all our foods. And it's just, and then and a lot of other stuff. In your book, do you talk about like absolute no's in certain types of food then? So maybe no boxed foods, no packaged foods, no certain ingredients. Is there kind of like a rule, or?
No, because we don't want to make it that, I think that sometimes complicates it and confuses it in a way. Although I suppose you could say, we say, reduce your consumption of ultra processed food. So that's there. And there's nothing that we say specifically is that these foods that are ultra processed, that people should at some point, at some level, intuitively know what they are, by just looking at the packages, that there are things that have got ingredients in there that our grandmothers wouldn't recognize as food. So those are the foods we need to reduce. We do talk about processed food and processing, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And so we try to distinguish between ultra processed and processed foods.
Mm-hmm.
So processing is any change to the natural state of the food. Right. So that could be cooking it, or it could be freezing or canning. Some canning is good, and some canning they just add a whole bunch of sugar to it. So those things would be ones you'd need to look at the can. But if it's just a can of tomatoes that essentially have been canned, then they can be just as nourishing as tomatoes off the vine.
Right.
Freezing is fine, can absolutely preserve the nutrients when they're frozen. Pasteurization, that's a form of processing. So we want people to understand that actually processing doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's enabled humans to get to the point where we are now, to, and it certainly led, the discovery of fire led to some massive changes in our brain development. So we don't want to discourage eating those types of, using those methods to modify our food.
diagnosed with postpartum depression, and then
Mm-hmm.
I was on antidepressants for a
Mm-hmm.
while. So some of the SSRIs,
Yeah.
and at a certain point, they put me on antipsychotics for
Yeah.
just a little bit.
Yeah.
And then they wanted me to try some of those other kind of add-on medications for
Mm-hmm.
like bipolar,
Yeah.
schizophrenic.
Yeah. I'm
Um,
sorry to hear that.
and they never talked about that some of these, like you were mentioning, that if you take something, it may deplete, right? So if you're focused on cortisol, you may deplete yourself of other nutrients. So when they talk about these medications, not once did my psychiatrist ever say, well, now you'll be depleted of some of your B vitamins. And so
Yeah.
therefore, right? And
I know
I
but that's
remember,
because they don't know it. They don't know it. So they've chosen not to look there.
and it just seems so logical, right? So if it
Mm.
goes in your body, something else is going to get depleted. And I
Yeah.
remember asking my psychiatrist, and he said, no, there's no nutritional differences, whatever you eat. And I was like, okay, it didn't make
Really.
sense to me, but yeah. And so I just kind of went along with it at that point until I just kept needing a higher dose and I knew something
Yeah.
wasn't working. And it's just interesting that most, I guess, psychiatrists don't know that. So if someone were depressed or feeling down, what would you say? I'm guessing your first thing to say is to clean up the diet.
Mm.
Where are your
Yeah.
thoughts about kind of stress management, sleep,
Mm.
lifestyle, you know, met?
Yeah. Oh, goodness. It's part and parcel of a holistic approach to addressing our mental health. Absolutely. And, I guess because of the focus on food, tend to look like that secondary, but not at all. Oh my gosh, it's so important. Making sure you get your adequate sleep every night is my number one priority. I will not compromise. This also often becomes a problem with podcasts because I live in New Zealand and I'm asked to do them at 6 o'clock in the morning or five, and I'm like, I don't compromise my sleep. You're going to have to do it later. We need to find a different time, and and that's that's one thing that's those are some pretty clear rules that I make. And to make sure that that doesn't happen, that I don't compromise sleep. Meditation, yoga. I've just before we got on, I did an hour of yoga this morning. So I always find that really, if I start my day that way, it's a good way to start the day. So exercise, can't get a lot of exercise where I am right now. Your listeners, for your listeners to know that I'm in 2 weeks of managed isolation in New Zealand. It doesn't exist in the United States, but it's basically where you put in a hotel and you stay in one room for 23 hours and they let you out for 1 hour of exercise and a pen. So tiny little, kind of like a parking lot. And this is the way New Zealand has managed to keep COVID out of the community. But it's a sacrifice. It's a huge sacrifice for people to be isolated in this way when you go overseas. And for me, it was bereavement. And, you kind of just do what it is.
Yeah.
So, but getting exercise is important. Sunlight, walking on the grounding, bare feet on the sand, use really, these are all wonderful, things that we can all do. For some people, cleaning up the diet when they're really down is just too hard.
Yeah.
And so that's when we might say, try the supplements first. And then once you get to a better place, then you might start to change your diet. And we've seen that many, many, many times in our research of people kind of going, oh, wow, these micronutrients are quite powerful. Maybe I should be thinking about what I put in my mouth. So that kind of aha moment often happens. But some people are just, it's too hard. And I'm completely sympathetic to what happens when people are really low. It is hard to even just get out of bed. So for me to kind of go, okay, well, you're going to start cooking now. That's not a simple thing for people to do, but even small steps, really small steps, choose maybe one meal a week to change that, or maybe a goal of reducing intake of energy drinks, or sort of some shifts, some very slow shifts in that direction, in the right direction. Maybe learning to cook one meal a week, or getting together with other people. I mean, social engagement is just obviously a really important part of recovery as well. So yes, those things are all important.
Yeah, I feel that social connection, we are naturally community oriented species. And even this isolation has been really hard for many. And I wonder if that plus the excess cortisol that then will make you nutrient depleted. And then I'm sure people reaching for the sugars because of the stress, like all of that combined just caused a lot more mental health during the pandemic.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So where can people find your book and, learn more about your work?
Sure. Well, I have it right here, so can at least know what it looks like, except I've got this blur.
Yeah, if you
There
come a
we
little
go.
bit closer. Okay, I could see it. Yeah. And I'll put
Oh, except it's reversed. I don't know why that does it.
It looks fine on my end.
Oh, it does. Okay, so it's from my perspective, it looks backwards. Okay, so Better Brain is where I would start to know more about what we've done. Co-authored with Bonnie Kaplan. It's currently available on Amazon. I guess I hate having to say that, but that's the easiest way is just look there, or through your independent bookstores. They hopefully have them as well. And yeah, that's where I would start. Another thing, if people are really interested in their, maybe even at the professional level, health professionals who are wanting to know more about this interface between mental health and food, then I've developed an online course. Go onto an edX platform. They do all these online courses, and just search for mental health and nutrition, or put my name in, and it's a 6-week course. It's free, and it's video. So if people prefer to learn via video rather than reading a book, and you can get a verified certificate if you want to, and so you pay $150 US for that. And we've gotten tons of great feedback. 16,000 people have done it since we started it in March, which is I'm pretty excited about how many people we've been able to engage in it. It's for the public can do it too. But I get contacted a lot by people, mental health professionals, nutritionists, dietitians, psychologists all over the world saying, how can I learn more about this? And at the moment, there isn't a lot out there around a specific degree that can train you in this area. I didn't get it. This is everything I know, and everything I've shared with you, everything in the book is stuff I've learned after my PhD. So it's been on the ground. It's been reading a lot, attending conferences from different sides. I've been to conferences, interestingly, pharmacologists or dietitians or psychiatry conferences. There's now a society of nutritional psychiatry, so that's been a great initiative. So there's no kind of, it hasn't happened yet that there's this place where you can get this level of education. And so that's why, one of the reasons why I developed that course, that online course. It's a good start. It's hopefully a good starting point for lots of people trying to just better understand this whole area.
Okay.
So I hope that helps.
And I will put that in the show notes, and I'm sure a lot of people will look into it. I've actually been I've been contacted by several therapists and psychiatrists that actually try to now use nutrition for a lot of their mental health patients. So I definitely know that there's people that want to.
They're hungry. They're hungry for it. Yeah.
Totally. That's the best way to say it.
Exactly. So I do so many workshops now, and I've been doing that for quite a few years. But that's why I just can't reach enough people. That's why this online course has been so exciting, because I can now say, just go and do that first. It's no different from doing a workshop with me, and I just have only so many hours in the day.
Yeah, I totally get it. Well, thank you so much for your time. I hope that people, learn more about this, because this is
Mass online open access course.
Okay.
That's what it was. Mass online.
Okay,
Sorry,
I'll make sure to get the links. I'll try to find it, and if I have issues, I'll contact you. But thank you so much again. This has been wonderful.
Pleasure.
And
good.
It just really speaks to that food can be medicine, and we just need to fuel our bodies the right way. And this is a very powerful message. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, guys, all right, guys, I hope that this interview was very helpful. I hope you guys look into the book. There are tips that will support you in healing, and also maybe using food as therapy for mental health imbalances. Now, Dr. Rucklidge does focus on a Mediterranean diet, but she also understands that some people have sensitivities and food allergies to maybe certain plant foods. And so she understands that you have to do what makes sense for you. But overall, the key thing is to use nutrient dense foods and real foods to possibly support any mental health imbalances. All right, guys, you know the drill. Make sure to eat a lot of meat. Take care of your bodies because it is the only place you have to live. I will talk to you guys next week. Bye.